tragic, it's on Syria, and it is complex because when we talk about Syria, we're not really talking just about Syria, we're talking about a number of events, problems, conflicts that intersect with the Syrian uprising, and therefore it's really talking about the region and talking about international relations at the same time. And because it's very complex, I'm trying to cut down on some of the details, so I would like to find out through a show of hands a couple of things. So I'm going to ask a couple of questions, if you could just raise your hand. First of all, how many here have been following rather closely the events in Syria for the past 3 years? Okay. How many here know what Al-Raqqa is? Okay, that's great. It's just a province in Syria that is now controlled by ISIS. So that gives me a way to gauge, how to present things, how much detail to go into. I used to say earlier, perhaps in a year and a half ago, I used to say that all uprisings are complex, but the Syrian uprising has an added complexity because of the intersection of conflicts. At this point, however, I must say that even that seems like an understatement. It is difficult to address the Syrian uprising in one setting. Hey, Paul. It is difficult to address the Syrian uprising in one setting, let alone all the causes and dynamics that I would like to discuss, or one should discuss. So I'll focus on the main narrative of causes and dynamics and leave some of the details for the Q&A and discussion. I'll try to speak for about 45 minutes. Please give me a signal when I'm at 30 so I can wrap up. Clearly, we are now witnessing a lot more than the Syrian uprising, as I suggested. One can speak of a proxy, regional, or perhaps even a global war playing out in Syria. We have a number of parts, including, of course, the essential part, which does not get as much play in the past few months because, of course, ISIS hijacked the news and hijacked the interest of people and hijacked the emotions of people and hijacked even the intellectual imagination of people, unfortunately, at the expense of things that are far more problematic, far more structural, far more violent, and so on. However, the essential part remains the struggle within Syria to remove the Syrian regime by various domestic actors and groups who do not necessarily themselves get along and who are in many instances fighting with one another. And that's to say very little to nothing about how they themselves represent proxy wars, those groups fighting the regime. Essentially, we have 6 groupings that I'll discuss. I'll discuss the groupings within Syria that are fighting the regime, and then we'll talk about what is happening outside Syria, just to name the players, and then we can go on to discuss the causes and so on. I will talk about ISIS, but I would like for ISIS discussion to be somewhat confined. We can talk more in the Q&A so that it doesn't take over the discussion here. So the 6 groups are the following. First, we have the Free Syrian Army, the FSA. The FSA is actually it's an abstract thing that has some concrete elements to it. Kind of like, in a different way of course, but kind of like Al-Qaeda in the early 2000s, where everyone would say, we are with Al-Qaeda. If they commit an act, or if they embark on some sort of operation, they say, we're part of Al-Qaeda, because they can't say that and they get some play because of the salience of the name. In reality, Al-Qaeda really doesn't exist, or didn't exist after 2001 in any uniform, streamlined manner. The FSA is similar in that regard, okay, including the content. We're not talking about content at this point. However, the FSA's chances, or the FSA's fortunes, were much more pronounced and much more positive. They were more present. They were more numerous early on during the first 2 years of the uprising. Now the FSA have basically disintegrated into various groupings, some with different, some with an allegiance to this country and others to that country, but they still call themselves the FSA because there is some currency when you are the FSA. We're talking here about anywhere between 20 to 30,000 fighters, and fighters here is in quotation marks because we do not know the extent to which these people are actually fighters who are able to fight in battle in an efficient manner and kind of make a difference. Because picking up a gun in Syria, of course, means you're a fighter, but it really doesn't mean very much in terms of, in military terms sometimes. Actually, it could be an aggression if a fighting force has basically a proportion of 70% who are just novice fighters. It could be a liability. So we do not have very much information about numbers. With what we know is that it's been slashed considerably since the beginning of the uprising, the numbers for the FSA. Second, we have something called the Islamic Front. The Islamic Front is basically a collection of 7 Islamist parties, groups, movements, I shouldn't say parties, but groups or movements, who have come together in order to improve their chances at becoming a unified fighting force in light of the emergence earlier of Jabhat al-Nusra and of course later of ISIS. So these groups are considered the more uniformed, coherent fighting force that kind of surpasses the FSA in various ways and constituted the spearhead of the local Syrian non-extremist Islamist variety. Even though they are Islamists, they are supposed to be much more able to work with other groups than even Jabhat al-Nusra. And of course, Jabhat al-Nusra is able to work with other groups much more so than ISIS. So there are these really odd gradations that we should pay attention to because they mean something. It's not enough to say the Islamists and the secular opposition. These groups are led by a few groups. This group, or the Islamic Front, is led by a few fighting forces within. Among the 7, the most significant is Ahrar al-Sham. However, in the past few weeks, if you have heard, Ahrar al-Sham has taken a hit as a result of the bombing of a headquarter meeting that they have had where most of the leadership was killed. So again, this attack, which we still do not know exactly who performed it, some people will tell you we know. I personally don't think we do know for a fact, as is the case with many other facts that you will hear people talking about and with a lot of confidence, which should scare you, because if somebody's talking about Syria and especially events on the ground with a lot of confidence, it's really a good cause for skepticism. And by the way, a side note, if you are listening to all of this and I'm just getting started, or if you're paying attention, if you're watching the news, listening to reports, and reading articles, and if you feel confused, it means you're actually paying attention. So it's a good thing. Don't worry about it. If you feel that you've got this down, this means you really need to read a lot more. So the Ahrar al-Sham, even though they have been taken hits, they remain the most powerful within the Islamic Front, which is kind of disintegrating as we speak in one way or another, right? These are not concrete things that, or never were concrete things for us to say they're disintegrating now as if they've always been uniform and unified, but the level of disintegration is increasing with time, and largely because of the lack of hope, largely because of various forms of defeatism, largely because of forms of basically lack of resources. The other set of variables for why a lot of these groupings are losing ground is because they are moving from wherever they are to ISIS. ISIS recruitment has always been extremely good for them, for their numbers, and after the US bombings, recruitment has actually shot up. And this is one of the reasons why many of us were opposed to the bombing, which really does not serve the end for which we say the bombing is taking place. Third, we have Jabhat al-Nusra. Jabhat al-Nusra is Al-Qaeda in Syria. Basically, it's the affiliate of, it's part of Al-Qaeda, now run by Ayman al-Zawahiri, but the Syria branch. And of course, you also have ISIS, which I'll talk about in a minute. ISIS is Islamic State in Iraq and Sham, or the Levant, or Syria. and the difference between them is instructive. Al-Qaeda slash Jabhat al-Nusra are different anyway from one another. Al-Qaeda is almost an abstract network with very little geographic stable presence. So let's put that aside. Jabhat al-Nusra, as a part of Al-Qaeda, is quite Syrian. They are made up, in terms of personnel, made up of mainly Syrian fighters. Their horizons are Syrian. They're looking at Syria as the target, as the prize. And they are fighting for Syria, for rule in Syria, or for influencing rule in Syria. And ISIS, on the other hand, is somewhat similar, even if more stringent in ideology and more reactionary in ideology, is much more ambitious. Their horizons are not limited to Syria. It's actually Syria and Iraq, and of course, depending on which ISIS you read, which ISIS reports you read, you find out that they have ambitions beyond Iraq and Syria. The reality is that their ambitions are right now confined to Iraq and Syria in terms of the core writing, the core literature on territorial matters. Another difference between ISIS and Al-Qaeda slash Jabhat al-Nusra is the territorial ambition of ISIS, which Al-Qaeda didn't have, and again, al-Nusra confines it to Syria. Jabhat al-Nusra, however, is much more flexible, despite the critique of a lot of people of the Islamist opposition in Syria, or the opposition in general in Syria. Jabhat al-Nusra is much more likely to work with others, to build alliances with people who are not like-minded. That's why Jabhat al-Nusra was not exactly on board with ISIS in terms of imposing the jizya tax, the tax for minorities, and so on and so forth. Not because it's not in their sights, but it's because they are strategic enough to understand that this is not something that will further their mission at this point when you need collective action. So these differences are important. However, the resources and the recruitment ability of ISIS are much greater. And you will see that Jabhat al-Nusra in the recent period has been trying to carry out operations, whether vis-a-vis Hezbollah or vis-a-vis other military targets that attempt to say or to make a statement that we too are in the field, we too command attention, we too are a force to reckon with, because ISIS had basically, they stole the show in the past few months. Coming to ISIS, it's a can of worms, because we talk about ISIS as if it's, as if it just appeared in a vacuum, and many of us are tremble at some of the images we see and are taken aback by the barbarism and by the just sheer reactionary mode that ISIS is. And of course, all of these reactions are justified because what they're doing is indeed very problematic. However, and instead of talking about ISIS separately, I'll quickly talk about a few things that have to do with ISIS. So we're stopping here before we move on. So we should see ISIS as a microcosm of regional effects. And I'll say a few comments about ISIS so that we can put things in perspective, because in a way, talking about ISIS can be instructive in terms of talking about everything else. First of all, we have very little information on specifics regarding ISIS. We also don't have a unit, an entity called ISIS that is the same everywhere. We have ISIS, the idea, and we have different manifestations in north, east, west, northeast of Syria, some in the south. We have different manifestations in Iraq, although they're more consolidated in Iraq because ISIS emerged out of the Islamic State in Iraq early on under the leadership of Abu Mus'ab al-Zarqawi in the post-2003 invasion period. So ISIS is many different things, and ISIS can be more stringent or more conservative or more brutal in one place than it is in another, and it could be more not sympathetic, but a bit more merciful in other places than in some places. So it's important to recognize this kind of diversity, and therefore not take some articles or most articles with a grain of salt. So much so that what we did at Jadaliyya is we put together a list of about 600 or 700 pieces, articles, reports, statistics on ISIS, and then we narrowed them down to about 100. We published them as a monthly roundup on ISIS in the news. In September, we're doing this again in a few days for October, just to show the breadth of coverage on ISIS, not all of which is actually on point, but we publish some of these pieces that we don't think are on point because it's important to publish them, given who wrote these articles and given their influence and given their consequentiality. So if you would like to look at this, you can just punch in ISIS in the news onto the media, and you get basically, if you have a paper to write, or if you have if you'd like to do your own research, you get a really good chunk of material. The second thing is the question on ISIS is the question of uniqueness. We speak of ISIS as though it's the only or main cauldron of violence or disgust in the region and in the world. I mean, granted, ISIS is barbaric, and its actions are disgusting, and what they do, especially on television, which is what we see, right? I mean, they operate as a fighting force and as a social force as well elsewhere. So we don't see the normal things, even if those normal things are not to our tastes, but it's not all, about beheadings and so on. Nonetheless, the question of the overall behavior is, of course, very problematic. However, if we step back from this rather, straightforward liberal mindset that is governed very much by what kind of mainstream corporatized media that brings us these figures and these graphics, we find out very easily and without much, knowledge and years of reading, we find out that the total sum of violence perpetrated by ISIS is but a fraction of the violence perpetrated by states in the region and beyond, including, of course, the brutal rule of Saddam Hussein, the brutal rule of Hafez Assad and now his son, and the manner in which they have actually dealt with the uprising in Syria, which involves so much brutality and so much killing that it really makes ISIS crimes pale into insignificance in terms of proportion. And also, ISIS's violence pales in comparison to the violence and death and killing and destruction that the United States has imposed or imparted on the region, specifically Iraq, from 1991 through the 13 years of the most devastating sanctions in human history against the population, not against Saddam Hussein or the government, because most of the victims and most of the cost was paid by the people over 13 years. And then, of course, a fraudulent war in 2003 that opened the door for so much chaos and created a vacuum of authority, primarily as a result of our brilliant idea of dismantling the army, because it's a Ba'athist army, leaving room for everything that has happened over there in Iraq as a result of these actions and as a result of the invasion. And of course, there are details that gets us from point A to point B that one can talk about, but they've been repeated so often that it's not a puzzle. So in a sense, what we are seeing in terms of ISIS is the disturbing graphic nature of their acts. But if you actually think about it, we do not see the immediate effects, at least not on mainstream news, of, for instance, the barrel bombs that are thrown by the Syrian regime. We don't see the thousands of pieces that the bodies of children or men and women who are innocent civilians that are shattered by drone bombs that we actually throw, whether in Yemen or Pakistan or where have you, right? If we saw these things, we would also have a very similar reaction, maybe not as much, right? Because you don't have the direct exercise of power and brutality, but it will sensitize us in a different kind of way. But we don't see those things. So in our mind, the beheading of a few people, and in fact, to be quite honest, the beheading of 2 Americans and a British person and so on and so forth, which is a handful of people, becomes cause for us to be outraged at something as opposed to the set of violence that has been taking place that has claimed more than 200,000 lives in just the Syrian situation, and several hundred thousand lives in Iraq, some say more than 1.8 million since 1991. that is a function of the invasions and the ensuing chaos and violence. So it's important to put this in perspective, not to pardon or to understand, but to understand the big picture, right? And to understand why we might be moved by something, but the rest of the world or people in the region who have access to all the other forms of violence are moved, but not to the same extent, because in their mind, in the political economy of memory and the political economy of pain and the political economy of perception, these other things take up room, right? It's not just the beheading that is outrageous. Having said that, I personally don't like beheadings. I especially don't like to be exercised on me. And that's just in case people misunderstand where I'm coming from. In fact, I also don't like the death penalty that we impose on people in this country. I think it's all not nice. Third, well, I talked about Al-Qaeda not being ISIS. Finally, before I get to the causes of the emergence of ISIS and why it's important for us to pay attention, even if we don't, let it hegemonize our perception of what's happening in the region. The fourth thing is the question of estimating and underestimating and overestimating ISIS. ISIS is a very powerful force, but the reason we have overestimated ISIS, or many of us have overestimated ISIS, and now everybody and their neighbors writing about ISIS, even if they don't know very much about the Middle East. The reason is there is a huge blind spot in the mainstream media, especially in the United States, regarding what happened in Iraq between 2007, 2008, and 2011, 2012, 2013. The number of reports is actually quite disturbing in terms of how few reports we have had on Iraq in the past several years. And we're talking about CNN, we're talking about the mainstream, we're not even talking about Fox News or places of this sort. Actually, it's not even fair anymore, I think, to criticize Fox News. So in a sense, we don't know how over the years, and even before 2007, 2008, this body that we call ISIS, this entity, has actually been accumulating power and resources and connections and networks, and creating networks with very powerful individuals and wealthy individuals, and especially in the Arab Gulf, and especially in the country that is the closest ally to the United States among Arab countries, which is Saudi Arabia. So this is not something that people who are watching the news, following what has been going on, are as shocked by, right? So it's a trajectory that is actually quite understandable. And if you look at the growth of ISIS, you see that it had the ability to capitalize on areas that have been completely devastated by the war in Iraq. It starts kind of from areas of the sort, like Fallujah, where 1 out of every 4 children is born with a defect as a function of the weapons we have used in Fallujah. So you go to Fallujah and you're ISIS, and you're providing resources, people are going to like you. So it is not a huge puzzle in some cases. And the more important point is how, besides the fact that we have a blind spot, is how we don't always realize that ISIS's conquests are limited to rural areas where the populations do not have complex demands. So the idea that ISIS is going to take over everywhere and everything is just not rational for anybody who is following what is going on. Hence, their biggest victories have been in places like Al-Raqqa in Syria, the province of Al-Raqqa, where it's a relatively rural area, underdeveloped, and for the most part, comparable areas in Iraq. They are not able to deal with large cities with populations that have complex demands that they cannot, fulfill, and they would have to use an inordinate amount of violence to actually stay there, which means that their stay and their presence is not going to last very long. It's not very sustainable. That is the main limitation of ISIS, precluding, God forbid, they basically liberalize their approach and they become more tolerant. In that case, they can actually have more of an impact, they can have more of a sustainable presence, and so on and so forth. But it's important to understand that dimension. Now, in terms of the causes, of course, it's not a puzzle that the invasion of Iraq, based on extremely fraudulent grounds, which thank God we have the CIA to tell us this is the case years after, because then people would be like, oh, okay, so all right, so we messed up, because until then, you know, and until now, there are some people who think it was still a good thing what happened in Iraq and the invasion of Iraq. So, of course, this is part of the problem that's created an incredible vacuum of authority, vacuum of any semblance of central power or vacuum of infrastructure. It was a kind of event that, especially after 2001, and especially after the war on terrorism, and in the manner that it was conducted, it basically invited everyone into Iraq. I and friends of mine entered into Iraq in 2003 in a huge GMC without even being searched in July of 2003, just a couple months after the invasion, to make our film. And nobody searched us. And it wasn't a coincidence, because when we had to call for support, where people brought us more equipment and batteries, they also weren't searched. We could have had in our GMC, we could have had, both cocaine and Bin Laden, and nobody would have actually known. And it was part of a larger plan, apparently, of just inviting people to Iraq. Kind of like I think our president was implying when he said, former President George Bush, that we're going to, take the fight away from the United States and just keep it in the region. Actually, by doing so, and of course, it became a self-fulfilling prophecy that Al Qaeda was in Iraq, but only after the invasion. And that, factor is something that is always brushed aside or jettisoned when somebody's talking about ISIS and the causes for its emergence. This is one cause. The other cause, which I feel is more structural, because it pertains to a lot of countries where that has taken place. The other cause is severe authoritarian rule, especially in countries that include pluralist communities, various diverse societies, whereby one kind of minority, if you will, is perceived to be repressing the rest. The point here is that authoritarian rule eliminates lawful avenues for vocal participation, and that pushes the opposition into basically a cycle of radicalization. And to the extent you have repression, is the extent to which you will find a radicalized opposition. Mix that or add to that in a very basic manner, it doesn't even have to be a sophisticated manner, external intervention and the propping up of certain dictators, either by the Soviet Union or Russia or by the United States, and you get a feeling of helplessness among the opposition that usually expresses itself in ways, as we have seen, and especially in the absence of a stable rule, even if repressive. So we have seen the emergence of these kinds of groups in both Iraq and Syria in ways that many did not predict, when the Syrian regime and the Iraqi regime either began to fall apart or lose control of the entire territory that they used to control. Another factor is the growing sectarianism, both manufactured and organic. So I say manufactured and organic because, of course, there is sectarianism, and of course, one of the countries that has actually promoted sectarianism in one way or another under the garb of Wahhabism is Saudi Arabia, which, of course, ended up unwittingly and unintentionally giving rise or legitimacy to the rise of ISIS as a Wahhabist manifestation. So there's this kind of sectarianism that has been coming out. There's the sectarianism that the Syrian regime has exhibited, especially after the uprising, much more so than before the uprising, as a way of maintaining their own cadres. And of course, the sectarianism of the opposition in rallying the Sunnis, as though this is really about Sunnis and non-Sunnis, as opposed to fighting an authoritarian regime in Syria. So there's this kind of sectarianism. There's another kind of perceived sectarianism that is actually not talked about, even among a lot of people in the region, even among the leftists in the region that supposedly are aware of a lot of these issues and are not Islamophobic and not Orientalist and so on and so forth. and that is the model Sunni, average Sunni human